hello and welcome back to another fabulous session. Well, I think they're fabulous sessions. We've got something really interesting that's happening today. And for those of you that can see us, you can see that I'm sitting next to Grant Turner from Ray White Commercial. Grant specializes in large retail format.
Large format retail?
Thank you, large format retail. Close, same sort of thing. And Grant and I were having a discussion about vacant properties, about the risks, the effects, what you can do with vacant properties. And I thought, what a good idea. Let's do a podcast. Let's do a chat about it, because he was asking really interesting questions. And I want to share those questions with you, and I want to share that information. I want to share those answers with our audience. So I said to Grant, hey, Grant, come on to the podcast. He loved the idea. Check it in.
And so I suppose if we take a step back, let's go back and maybe paint the situation. Probably about 6 weeks ago, I was marketing a particular property that was actually, in this case, a 175 square metre warehouse on the south side, but circumstances that it was vacant. And what it was, the owner in this situation, every property has their own story, but the owner, it was owner occupied for quite some time. Health reasons forced them to actually close the business. Unfortunately, one of the business partners passed away due to those health circumstances. And it was been a really tough time for the wife now and the other business partner. And so they approached me and they just needed to get this sold. And so for a number of reasons, they've actually chosen to go down the auction path with this property. And it makes it a little bit hard dealing with people like yourself, Mish, who deals with a lot of investors buying a vacant property. So I suppose there's a couple of questions that, we were chatting about that afternoon and if we start with the first one, is, what are the impacts, the real financial impacts to an investor in buying a vacant property?
Okay, so just backtracking a little bit, there's at the moment the talk on the street is that there's a lack of good commercial properties. However, there's quite an abundance of vacant properties, and that's why I thought this would be a great conversation piece to have from both seller and buyer's perspective. So Grant's asked me the question about what the risks are and what the implications are on buying a vacant property. And I think the first one that comes to mind is GST, because, if you're buying a property for $1 million and you've got to pay GST, that's 10% on top of that, you've got to make sure that you do have that cash at offer, at settlement when you're settling that property. So it definitely does have an impact on your purchasing capacity, your purchasing power.
Yep. So GST, 10%, $100,000 goes towards GST. So let's just talk about this up as we go, because this is where I think it started to get a little bit interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, from an owner-occupier's point of view, I'm going to say anyone who's a savvy owner would move into that property and put a lease on it straight away, or they would put a lease onto that property before they move in, before they transact. And the reason for that is, and I'm saying savvy owner-occupiers, because if they're putting a lease on their property before they transact, before they settle, they don't have to pay their 10%.
Yes.
Now, you as investors, if you want to do the same sort of thing, there are ways in which you can do this that, let's call it smart, a little bit under the table, but there are ways and means it can be done. Okay, there are a couple of tricks. Let's say these are a couple of tricks to the trade.
Are we going to cover that later, or is that?
We're going down that rabbit hole. We might as well talk about it now. I think one of the questions that I often have from investors is, if they're paying for the GST up front, do they get that money back? And I always say to them, yeah, of course you are going to get that money back. You can claim on the GST expense in your next quarter, depending on how you purchase that property. So if you're purchasing it in an entity that is GST registered, you can claim your GST back. But most definitely speak to a professional speak to your accountant to find out how and what the best way is to put this whole thing together, okay, before you purchase the property.
Okay, so you said depending on how you claim it,
Yes.
like what are we expecting? 50 grand back, 10 grand back of that? We'll just use that $1 million example as a bit of consistency.
Yeah. Grant, I couldn't tell you offhand because I'm not an accountant.
Okay.
So, and that's why I say before you enter into something like this, I think it's vitally important that you surround yourself with the right people, with the right advice.
Yeah.
And most definitely a question for the accountant. My guess is that you would get most of that back depending on what you're running through. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a
well, that's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes.
On that. And maybe for another podcast, we could probably get someone in to talk about some advice in this area.
We most certainly would. However, and this is a huge however, anybody who's been in business for a while and understands how the tax man pays out, the likelihood is that they're not going to pay you out in your 100 grands cash the way that you're paying it in.
Yeah.
It's going to be offset. Okay. Yeah. And I think that is a big thing to take into consideration because that money leaves your pocket. Yes, you do get it back in as taxable income, as a GST, you claiming your GST at your BASs.
Yeah.
But do you actually get that money go into your account? Leave that for your accountant to tell you.
Yep. No, good advice there, as always. So I've heard about escape clauses. Like if we're going to go down that path of putting in a lease before settlement, let's talk about ideas in that space.
Okay. So there are a couple of ways to do this. You can basically put a lease on that property if you're going to buy it. Let's say for argument's sake you're an owner-occupier and you put a lease on the property, you're going to occupy that property and you put a 3+3 year lease on it, okay? You can put an escape clause in that lease to say that you can sublease it, number one, or that you can terminate the lease under certain conditions and you can bring another tenant in.
Okay.
So that would basically help you with your finance, that would help you with the GST. Okay. It has to be relatively legitimate, so they want a bona fide lease in place. And I think the biggest impact that investors need to take into consideration is that your lender is going to have a look at that lease and your lender is going to be saying to you, are you really going to occupy that property?
Yeah.
You know, are you legitimately going to occupy? Some lenders do, some lenders don't, depending on the type of lender that you're using. However, it would allow you to do the lending and it would take that GST component away.
And I think you were talking about that quite clearly, is obviously not just putting in a lease that sits there for 6 months, but needs to be obviously 1 year plus for a bank to actually be having a legit look at giving you some borrowings around that purchase.
Yeah, and I would take that one step further. I mean, if you're going to put a lease in it, a lease on the property, I would say put a 3-year lease on it because the banks really value the longer your lease, the better the value. You know, so they're going to look at that with through their serious eye glasses.
Yeah.
As opposed to just putting a 1-year lease in. The 1 year is a little bit light. It's going to affect your lending capacity.
Yep.
And you know the banks are going to question. Your lenders, let's say, are going to question, is it legitimate or is this just a, screen?
Now, I think I recall you talking about how important it is that if you are going to put in a lease, it's at market value, because you had some challenges, I believe, with some other borrowings because a particular owner wanted to, or an investor wanted to inflate it, and that was causing some dramas. So getting that on point is key.
Yeah, I think that's very vital information, because when you're purchasing this property, you've got the lender's valuer that's going to come in and vet the property. If the property is under rented, they're going to pick that up straight away and they're going to want to put it at valuation. If the property is over leased and over rented, they're going to pick that up straight away and they won't give you the valuation that you need. So it's vitally important that you're doing this at market rate.
Yeah.
Do your homework, make sure that it is at market rate. And that works for both the buyer as well as the seller.
Yeah.
We see properties, 100 to the dozen, especially leaseback properties, where vendors want a higher price, they want a higher selling price, So they're beefing their rentals up.
Yeah.
Those properties are falling over. We might vet them and say, oh, they might be on the higher side, but the value is going to come in and say, no ways. They're going to knock 150K off their property straight away. The vendor is going to be stuck with the property. And long story short, they need a little bit of a reality check, because if it's 150,000 out of pocket, I'm just using that as a number.
Yeah.
And you're the first one to go to contract, well, the chances are it's going to happen again and again and again until they have that reality check. So vitally important, if you're putting a lease on the property, do it at market rate, find out what the market comparables are in the complex, in the area, and most certainly do it at market rate so that everything stacks up. You don't want any red flags.
Yep. Okay. So we got some strategies around potentially the GST and ways that we can possibly avoid that if we've got the lease lined up, setting up a proper strong lease, 3 years at market value at a minimum. I suppose the other thing we talked about, I suppose, for investors to be aware of is the vacant property and holding costs.
Yes, most certainly. So if you are going to put let's call it a curtain or a screen lease on that property, you are going to have holding costs, because so long as that property is standing empty and it's not a going concern, there's no business that's truly running through that property, you don't have rental income. Unless you do have a business that could be paying for it, and bearing in mind that because it's a lease, that lease does need to be paid for. In the lender's eyes, they want to see money going in and money coming out. Okay, so you need to have that legitimate transaction happening for the lenders to be happy with it.
And then I suppose the other side from the agency side of things is, going through the leasing process, you've got leasing fees that can be like 10 to 15 to 20%, depending on the size of the property and the length of the lease that gets in place. So let's work off that $1 million. Let's say it's a $50,000 lease. That could be five grand or plus there in leasing fees. You got marketing fees, real commercial, and some of the portals are real costs these days. So it's easy to chew up another $5,000 there in marketing.
So you're up to 10 grand.
Yeah. So before, it's just, I suppose these are just real numbers that need to go into the ledger for having a vacant place. And one thing that you could always look at is, if you have got an unconditional contract, getting permission to start the marketing for finding a tenant before it actually goes to settlement. So not waiting until D-Day. And I know in that particular property, because we had a lot of interest coming from investors, we got the owner's permission, and they actually invested in the marketing on Real Commercial for a tenant. They had no desire to put a tenant in, but at least we started to collect a pool of people. So it gave a bit of confidence to an investor that at least they can move it over from day one, day two.
Okay.
That sort of things.
So in other words, there's interest by doing that, by going to market a little bit earlier, running the rental campaign, and there's interest.
And nothing beats a heads of agreement, at least, that says someone will pay X versus an agent opinion saying that this is what the market value should. And I think you've got to be careful of those pitfalls as well. So.
Yeah, and again, and I'm talking from the lender's perspective, because as a buyer, you want to get certainty, and just as much as what the lender wants to get certainty. Heads of agreement are all very good and well, but we've seen thousands of heads of agreement falling over. So it's all very good and well to get that heads of agreement in, and you want to really try and get that lease signed before
and in place
before settlement. Now, I usually ask for it before unconditional.
Okay.
And the reason for that is it really gives certainty that this deal is going to go through. Again, for the seller as well as the buyer. And for the lender. Okay. And it might put a little bit of a delay.
And even if, and every seller is different, but you might even ask for a 90-day settlement with it settling within 2 weeks of a formal lease being put into place, so that it can be moving forward if things all line up. It gives you the time to get that result. But anyway, there's many creative ways. So Was there anything else that you wanted to say about the lending and the different rates at which they would lend on these situations?
Look, under normal circumstance, and it's going to change from lender to lender depending on whether you're working with first tier lenders or second tier lenders. Often I'm going to put my neck out over here and say if the property is vacant, they're going to value that property as a vacant property. However, because there's not a lease in place, it's an investment property, you probably find that you're not going to get more than about 50% LVR on it.
Okay, yeah.
Whereas the minute you've got a lease on it, you immediately jump up to round about 65%. And guys, these are round figures, not to say that they would specifically be those exact figures, but I'm giving you just like an idea of more or less how and where it would be for lending for your LVR on that.
Yeah. So I think that were the key things that we covered. I'm going to put you on the spot, Mish. And because we have covered a fair bit here.
Yeah.
If you were to summarize from all the great gems that you've shared with us, what would you say are the 5 things to keep in mind if walking in to buying what is currently a vacant investment property? 5 things, okay?
That is a spot question, Grant.
That is a spot question. Here we go.
Okay.
Hope everyone's got their pen and paper out like I do.
So firstly, I'm going to say vacancy rate. So the first thing you want to do before you even go and see their property is check out what the vacancy rate is. The second thing that you want to do is have a look at what your cost per square meterage is. So your leasing cost per square meter, as well as your purchase cost per square meter. So you want to know whether you are purchasing that property at the right price based on the cost per square meter, and you're going to be picking that up from doing a cost analysis, by doing a rental analysis, cost analysis. I'm also going to say as a vacant property, it is very handy to know if there are any developments in that area, what those developments are selling for, and what their cost per square meterage is. Because if you're purchasing a property, let's say, at $4,500 per square meter, and the developers are developing a brand new unit a kilometer or two down the road at 4,500, well, you've already lost a portion of your depreciation. They're going to get 100% depreciation, which means that your property is older, there's moving parts. So you really should be buying that property for quite a lot less than that. All right. You can look at your rebuild costs if you really want to go into it to see what rebuild costs would cost you should the place burn down or collapse completely. That gives you a good idea.
Number 5. Come on, number 5. Well, listen, I'm going to throw in number 5. Okay. I'm going to throw in number 5, and I'm going to say make sure you got a professional team on your side. Now, I know you don't like to toot your horn too much, but I've seen a lot of buyers working with you, so having a really good buyer's agent, I think, is key. But second of all, we've spoken today how important a really good accountant and a good solicitor is, because strong, solid advice in those areas could actually make a huge impact to how you purchase the property and how you can actually, I suppose, play with the GST components and bits and pieces. So I'm going to say number 5, have a solid professional on your side.
And I'm going to absolutely second that. Thank you, Grant.
You're welcome.
Most certainly. You want to make sure that you do have the right team. You want to make sure that when you're doing something like this is something that's slightly left field of vanilla investing. And my number 5 was going to be due diligence.
Okay.
So your due diligence is slightly different, and you want to be checking all your moving parts and all your electricals and that sort of stuff, being that it's a dated property. But yes, having the right information before you go into this, having the right professionals that are giving you that information before you go into it, absolutely vital to making this work. And see if you could find a good agent that's going to be transparent and open with you and give you that information. And realistically, at the end of the day, I always say, you're not going out to battle, okay? You're going out to resolve. This is resolving an issue. It's resolving a problem, like in this case, a deceased estate, a very troubled wife, she's in a pickle. She does need to sell, but at the same time, she needs to sell at market value. You know, so there's various ways to work with her as the vendor, you as the buyer, and then the agents in between. Peacekeepers.
Perfectly said.
Grant, I want to thank you for joining me. This has been a fun little snippet and an interesting topic because a lot of people ask about buying, vacant properties. And guys, just from my perspective, be bold. Get out there and, there is stock in the market that is vacant. We've given you a couple of golden nuggets here. Don't hold back. Reach out if you want to know more. Feel free to reach out. Let us know what your questions are, what you need to know. And if you want more information, then jump into the website revolvecommercial.com.au and go and have a look at all the other episodes that we've got. Make sure you subscribe, tune in for more insights. And until the next time, thank you, Grant, for joining me.
Look forward to the next one, Mish.